Why did no one notice her before that day? Why did she sit there, silent, as if the entire academy didn't exist? The mess tent at West Point Field was alive with noise that afternoon, the low roar of cadets scraping trays, the stench of mud, sweat, and steel. The air hung heavy with exhaustion. A week of brutal field exercises had stripped them all down to the bone, the pride, the polish, the pretense gone. What remained were hungry, young soldiers pretending they weren't terrified of failure. And in that restless chaos, one figure sat apart. A woman alone. She could have been anyone, a supply contractor, maybe logistics staff. Her gray polo shirt and faded cargo pants made her invisible, just another ghost in the machine of military routine. Her hair was streaked with silver that caught the dull light bleeding through the tent's canvas, and her skin carried the kind of weathered calm that only comes from years lived under foreign suns. She ate slowly, methodically, like someone for whom every movement still mattered. While others devoured their MREs like starving wolves, she lifted each spoonful of rehydrated chili mac with deliberate precision, quiet, unhurried, and completely indifferent to the restless energy around her. And maybe that was what caught his attention. Cadet Captain Marcus Thorne, 22, top of his class, brimming with arrogance disguised as confidence, noticed her calm and mistook it for weakness. He always did. He walked toward her table with that swagger cadets wore before they learned what real authority felt like, the kind earned through loss, not rank. His boots squelched in the mud-soaked boards, drawing eyes from every corner of the tent. Conversations fell silent. The low hum of the generator outside became the only sound. "You're in my spot, old-timer," Thorne said, his voice carrying across the room, slick with the confidence of youth. "And you're eating my rations. I suggest you move now." Some chuckles rippled through the tent. Others looked away, sensing the storm but unwilling to interfere. The woman didn't answer. She didn't even look up. She just brought another spoonful of chili mac to her lips, calm, steady. A drop of silence fell into the room like a stone in still water. From the far side of the tent, General Ivan Wallace, an old soldier with eyes that had seen too much, watched from the shadows. He'd been inspecting the cadets quietly, but now his attention shifted to the woman. There was something about her. Something not civilian. The way she sat, not relaxed but coiled. The way her eyes, without moving her head, scanned the room, noting exits, corners, angles of movement. The way her hands rested on the table, not soft or idle, but marked by the fine scars of utility. He had seen that posture before. Not in a cafeteria, but in a place where silence meant survival. Thorne didn't notice any of that. All he saw was defiance, and defiance demanded performance. He leaned closer, his smirk hardening. "Did you hear me?" he said louder. "That's the steak and cheese MRE, the best one, reserved for company commanders, and I am a company commander." Still no response. "You," he said, gesturing at her with mock disdain, "are a nobody, probably here to fix the water purifiers, so I'll say it again. Get up." Around them, cadets shifted uneasily. Even his friends, his loyal shadows, looked uncertain now. They knew this wasn't the kind of challenge you escalated. Something about her silence felt wrong, dangerous. But Thorne's ego had already taken over. He'd gone too far to back down. The woman, her name, according to the plain badge clipped to her shirt, was Evelyn Reed. Finished chewing, swallowed, and calmly placed her spoon down on her tray. The small plastic click echoed like a gunshot in the hush that followed. That single sound made every cadet freeze. Thorne felt a wave of heat rise to his face. Her silence, her calm refusal to acknowledge him, was worse than any insult. In a place where dominance ruled, she had dismantled his power without saying a word. He could have walked away. He should have walked away. Instead, he reached for his hip. A collective breath caught across the room. The cadets saw the motion. The holster. The glint of a blue barrel, a training weapon, standard issue for exercises, harmless in theory. But in this context, it wasn't harmless. It was a symbol. Thorne thumbed off the safety with a loud, theatrical click. He leaned down, the muzzle hovering inches from her temple. "I'm not asking anymore," he hissed. "Give me the food." For a second, even the air refused to move. The absurdity of it, a boy, pointing a toy gun at a woman old enough to be his mother, just to prove he could, sank into the hearts of everyone watching. He expected fear. He expected flinching, trembling submission. But she didn't blink. Her expression didn't change. Her breath didn't quicken. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, with an unsettling stillness, the kind that makes a predator doubt its own strength. And then a sound shattered everything. An ear-splitting siren. Red lights strobed through the tent, painting every face in emergency crimson. Code red, active assailant on base. This is not a drill. The voice over the loudspeakers was sharp, panicked, real. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Tables overturned. MREs spilled. Cadets scrambled for cover, shoving each other in blind panic. Thorne froze. His command voice vanished. He shouted, "Form a perimeter, Spartan company on me," but no one listened. Through the tent flap, two figures appeared, dark, fast, deliberate. They weren't cadets. They weren't pretending. They moved with a fluid, predatory rhythm, short bursts, coordinated shifts, the kind of motion only years of real combat can teach. "Opposition force," someone screamed. "They're the instructors." But even as the words left his mouth, Thorne knew something was wrong. This wasn't a drill anymore. The first black-clad figure entered, helmet, goggles, rifle up. He fired 3 bursts into the ceiling. The simunition rounds cracked like thunder. Everyone on the floor now. The tent exploded into movement. Cadets dove under tables, shouting over each other. Thorne stood in the open, heart pounding. He raised his blue barrel pistol, finger trembling, aimed, pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. Empty. He never reloaded after the range. And now, standing exposed in front of 50 cadets, he realized the humiliation waiting in that split second before consequence. The instructor turned toward him, rifle raised. "Your first captain," the man sneered, pathetic. Thorne's hands shook. He saw the dark abyss of failure and behind it fear. And that's when she moved. It wasn't fast. It was inevitable. Evelyn didn't rise, she unfolded. One moment she was seated, the next she was momentum itself. Her right hand shot out, fingers finding the sling of the instructor's rifle, the precise point below the collarbone where leverage met anatomy. She twisted. The weapon tore free as she pivoted, driving the sling's carabiner into the soft tissue of his throat. Her left palm struck upward, a perfect heel blade hit under his jaw, a snap, a collapse, silence. The man dropped before anyone understood what had happened. Thorne gaped. The cadets gaped. Even the second instructor froze in disbelief. She had dismantled a trained ranger in less than a heartbeat. No noise. No wasted motion. Just cold, absolute precision. The second assailant shouted and raised his weapon. She was already moving. A blur, a sweep. She scooped the fallen rifle from the floor, not to aim, not even to shoulder. 3 shots. Pop, pop, pop. First, the second man's rifle spun out of his hands. Second, the microphone on his helmet shattered. Third, his chin strap buckle snapped clean off. The helmet hit the floor, rolling to a stop at her feet. Silence returned, heavier than before. She stood there, breathing steady, rifle loose in her hand, her eyes calm. Not angry, not proud. Just still. The entire tent was frozen, cadets, instructors, even General Wallace at the edge of the shadows. He stepped forward slowly, boots clicking against the planks, his face unreadable. The old general had seen soldiers break, bleed, and die, but what he saw now was something else entirely. The woman didn't flinch as he approached. He stopped 5 feet away. The two instructors, one on his knees and the other bareheaded, snapped to attention. "General, sir," one stammered. "Unscheduled variable." Wallace raised a hand. Silence. He looked at her, really looked at her, and recognition sparked in his eyes. That stillness, that efficiency, that deadly grace. He'd seen it once years ago in a grainy briefing video labeled classified. Eyes only. A ghost. A name whispered through operations that never officially existed. The call sign burned into his memory. "Spectre." He took a slow breath, his chest tight with awe and disbelief. In the soft red pulse of the alarm lights, he reached into his vest, pulled out a datapad and typed her name. Evelyn Reid. A thin, empty file appeared: civilian contractor, logistics clearance. He bypassed it with his fingerprint, entered a 12-digit code. The real file opened. It wasn't empty. It was a legend written in classified ink. What the general saw on that datapad changed everything. The glow of the screen reflected in his eyes as he scrolled line after line, each one heavier than the last. The air in the tent felt frozen, as if time itself had paused to watch. Her name was Evelyn Reid. That was a shell, a shadow identity built to conceal something far larger. The screen pulsed with a black delta, overlaid by a trident and sword. Tier 1. The insignia reserved for the elite, those who operated so far off the books that even their ghosts had clearance levels. He scrolled further. Record states, 22 years of active service. Record states, founding member and lead strategist of a unit so secret its funding was buried in agricultural research grants. Record states, 4,000 combat hours logged across 17 hostile zones. Record states, recipient of 3 Silver Stars, 1 Distinguished Service Cross, and a decoration listed only as Presidential Cipher. Awarded for an action that prevented a global catastrophe. Wallace's throat tightened. He'd served long enough to know what wasn't written mattered more than what was. He'd read enough classified reports to understand the coded silences. Prevented global catastrophe could mean a nuclear plot stopped hours before detonation, or a rogue general neutralized before an uprising began. It didn't matter. Whatever it was, she had done it. The general scrolled to the bottom of the file, and there it was. Status: active reserve, category 0. Assignment: detached, United States Military Academy, purpose: infrastructure threat assessment. And in that moment, it all fell into place. She wasn't there to fix water purifiers. She wasn't there by accident. She was testing them. Testing their systems, their readiness, their leaders. And they had failed, catastrophically. Wallace exhaled slowly. When he looked up from the datapad, his eyes had changed. Not the eyes of a commander inspecting a subordinate, but the eyes of a soldier recognizing a superior. The cadets watched as he stepped forward, posture straightening, boots clicking with ritual precision. He stopped 2 feet from her. And then, to the shock of every living soul in that tent, the general saluted. Not a casual, perfunctory salute. A perfect one, sharp, deliberate, carved from reverence. "Ma'am," he said quietly, voice low and even. "My apologies, I was not aware you were on site." Gasps rippled through the tent. The cadets, still crouched in shock, tried to process what they were seeing. The general, a man whose reputation for discipline bordered on myth, was standing at attention before a supposed civilian contractor. Marcus Thorne's mind spun in circles. He didn't understand, couldn't. What did this woman, this quiet, gray-haired ghost, have that could make a two-star general salute her like that? But deep down, beneath the confusion and disbelief, something else began to form: shame. Wallace turned, his expression cooling into stone. His voice dropped to a controlled, thunderous calm. "Cadet Captain Marcus Thorne," he said. The words cut through the silence like a knife through silk. Thorne tried to stand, but his knees felt unsteady. "Sir." "Be silent." The general's gaze didn't waver. "You pointed a weapon, training or not, at a command-level strategic asset of the United States military," Wallace said. "You did so to intimidate her. You did so for a packet of food." Each sentence hit like a hammer. "You have not only failed as a leader," Wallace continued, his tone even colder now, "you have failed as a soldier. You confused rank with respect. You confused silence with weakness." The words burned. Every cadet felt them, because they all knew, in some small way, they had believed the same lie. Thorne's face drained of color, his mouth opened, but no words came. Wallace took one step closer, lowering his voice to something soft and far more dangerous. "You have brought shame upon this academy," he said, "and upon every soldier who ever carried this uniform with humility." Silence. No one moved, no one breathed. The woman, Evelyn Spector, whoever she truly was, hadn't flinched through any of it. Her eyes stayed calm, her hands still steady at her sides. When Wallace finally dropped his salute, it wasn't dismissal. It was reverence completed. He turned to his instructors. "Get medical on him," he said, nodding toward the downed ranger gasping for air, "and debrief the second, quietly." "Yes, sir." Within minutes, the tent began to empty slowly, reluctantly. The cadets filed out like ghosts, their whispers low, their eyes wide. Only Thorne remained, standing amid overturned trays and scattered food, his blue pistol still in the mud. She glanced at him once, not long enough to condemn him, not long enough to forgive. Just long enough to make him understand. She didn't see him as an enemy. She saw him as irrelevant. And that was worse. By nightfall, the entire base knew. Rumors spread like fire through dry grass. Some said she was CIA. Others swore she was part of Delta Force. A few claimed she wasn't even American. But everyone agreed on one thing: she had humbled a generation in a single, silent act. They gave the moment a name: the Spector's lunch. The corner table where she'd sat became off-limits. No one dared touch it. For the cadets, it wasn't a superstition, it was reverence. They'd seen power stripped of noise. They'd seen authority built on competence alone. Marcus Thorne's fall was quiet. No formal punishment. No expulsion. The academy didn't need to humiliate him. The silence did that better than any tribunal ever could. He ate alone now, the irony cutting deeper each day. The same loneliness he had mocked in her was now his own. And every time he looked toward that empty table, he felt the weight of what he'd done, not just the arrogance of pointing a weapon at her, but the blindness that had made him think he could. At night he lay awake, the tent canvas trembling in the wind, and replayed every second. The spoon, the siren, the movement too fast to follow. And that single, impossible truth: he had never seen anything like her. General Wallace's report went straight to a secure server, top clearance. The official line: unscheduled readiness test. Results below acceptable threshold. Action: internal remediation recommended. But in the general's private notes, he wrote something else, something no one else would see. "There are still warriors among us, quiet ones, the kind who remind the rest of us what discipline truly means. Evelyn Reed, alias Spector. I had forgotten what silence can do." He saved the file under one word: legacy. In the following days, the bass settled back into its rhythm, at least on the surface. But something had changed. The cadets who'd laughed during that lunch couldn't shake the image of her eyes, calm, steady, unshaken by mockery or threat. They carried it with them into drills, into study halls, into their own private silences. And Thorne, he began to realize his arrogance hadn't just embarrassed him, it had exposed him. He wasn't angry anymore, he was empty. The ranks and ribbons, the respect he once demanded, none of it mattered now. Not after standing in front of someone who had no rank, no title, no visible authority, yet commanded the room with nothing but presence. He started to avoid mirrors, because every time he saw his reflection, he didn't see a leader. He saw a boy holding a toy gun to a storm. He didn't speak to anyone about it. But wordlessly, he began to change. He listened more. He barked fewer orders. He found himself noticing the quiet cadets, the ones who didn't compete for attention. And sometimes, when he was alone, he'd catch himself asking a question he couldn't answer. Who was she really? Late one night, he saw a figure crossing the training field, slim, gray-haired, purposeful. She carried a small canvas bag slung over one shoulder, walking toward the motor pool. He almost called out. But he didn't. He just watched her disappear into the darkness. Something inside him whispered that if he followed, if he tried to explain or apologize or even thank her, he'd only prove that he still didn't understand. Because she didn't live in words. She lived in action. And maybe that was the first lesson she had truly taught him. The next morning she was gone. Her contractor ID revoked. Her quarters emptied. Her name erased from the logs. As if she had never been there at all. But she left something behind, not an object, not a note. Just a presence. A silence that spoke louder than any order ever could. And in that silence, every cadet who had seen her move, who had seen her stand against arrogance with nothing but calm, carried a fragment of her discipline forward. For Thorne, it was more than memory, it was rebirth. He would never see her again. But the lesson, the humiliation, the awe, the quiet understanding would shape everything he became. That day, a rumor began circulating through the academy halls, whispered by instructors, repeated by cadets with cautious reverence. She's not a contractor, they said, she's Spectre. And though no one ever found her file again, the story remained passed in silence, told as a warning, and remembered as a truth too heavy for textbooks. What does a man do after he's seen his own weakness? After arrogance has been stripped away and what's left is the raw truth, unflinching, cold, and deserved. Marcus Thorne didn't know. He moved through the following days like a ghost in his own uniform. The academy was alive with whispers, but none of them reached him directly. They didn't have to. He could feel their eyes. Every cadet who had once followed him with blind confidence now looked through him, as if he were a cautionary tale still walking. The command tent no longer called his name first. The instructors stopped using him as an example. Even his friends, the ones who had laughed when he first confronted her, had turned quiet. That's how guilt works. It isolates, it eats from the inside out. The mess tent still carried her absence. The corner where she'd once sat had become sacred ground. Someone, no one knew who, had left a folded napkin there, untouched since that day. It was a silent monument. No one dared sit in her place. They called it the Spectre's table. And though it sounded like a joke at first, there was nothing funny about it. It was respect, raw, uneasy, and unspoken. On the fifth night after the incident, Thorne lay awake in his cot, eyes tracing the seams of the canvas above him. He replayed every second again and again. Her silence, the spoon, the siren. Her sudden, surgical precision, violence without aggression, purpose without noise. He couldn't stop hearing the words the general had spoken. You confused rank with respect. You confused silence with weakness. He wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. Because deep down, he knew she hadn't humiliated him out of spite. She had done nothing to him. She had simply revealed who he really was. And that was worse than punishment. He'd spent years building his identity on the illusion of leadership. Commands barked, orders obeyed, power demanded. But that day, in the space of a heartbeat, she'd shown him what real authority looked like. And it wasn't loud. It was quiet, unshakable, undeniable. By the sixth night, the shame had turned into something else: need. Not for forgiveness, for understanding. He had to see her again. Not to defend himself, not to apologize, but to understand how someone could move through the world with that kind of peace, that kind of control. So he searched. He went through the usual channels first: the civilian contractor liaison, the logistics office, the instructor rosters. Each time the response was the same: no record of Evelyn Reed currently assigned. He even checked the base's gate logs. Her badge number had been deactivated within 24 hours. She was gone. But that didn't make sense. People don't just vanish, not even Tier 1 operators. Someone somewhere had to know. He asked his tactical officer, Major Sinclair. The man gave him a long, measured look before replying. "Drop it, Thorne." "Sir." "Drop it." Something in Sinclair's tone told him it wasn't a warning. It was protection. Still, Thorne couldn't let it go. The academy sat quiet that night. The moon cut a pale scar across the sky, washing the field in silver. Thorne walked alone, no flashlight, no destination. He didn't plan on finding her. He didn't even know what he'd say if he did. But something in his gut told him she hadn't left. He reached the maintenance bay, a wide, echoing hangar that smelled of oil and steel. And that's when he saw her. Evelyn Reid. Spectre. Sitting alone under the faint glow of a single work lamp. She wasn't in uniform, just a faded gray shirt, sleeves rolled up, wrists lined with quiet scars that told their own story. Before her on the metal table lay a disassembled rifle. Not the training kind, a real one, heavy, functional, scarred by use. She was cleaning it piece by piece, methodical and patient, like someone tuning a musical instrument. For a long moment, Thorne didn't move. He just watched. There was a serenity to her motions. The small, deliberate wipe of the bolt, the measured drop of oil along the trigger assembly, everything had meaning. It wasn't just maintenance. It was meditation. He took a hesitant step forward. She didn't look up, but he knew she knew. He could feel her awareness, that invisible field of perception that had made her lethal without lifting her voice. 20 feet away, he stopped. He'd rehearsed words earlier, apologies, explanations, maybe even a salute, but now none of them fit. They all felt hollow. So he said nothing. He just stood there, a soldier stripped of pretense, waiting. Minutes passed. The sound of the cleaning cloth sliding over metal filled the room. A soft, rhythmic sound, almost peaceful. And then she spoke. "Assumptions," she said quietly, not looking up. Her voice was calm, the kind of voice you lean in to hear. "They're heavy, Cadet." He swallowed, unsure if she was really speaking to him. "They weigh you down," she continued. "You carry them until you can't move, until you can't see what's right in front of you." She set the rifle's cleaned barrel aside, wiping her hands on a rag. "Travel light," she said simply. "That's the only way forward." She looked up finally. Her eyes met his. There was no anger there, no contempt. Only assessment, calm, clinical, but not unkind. It was the same look she'd given the Ranger instructor before dismantling him. Except now it wasn't a threat, it was a measure. She stood, the movement smooth and silent. Slinging the rifle over her shoulder, she walked past him. For a moment he thought she might stop, might offer him something more, a lesson, a word of forgiveness. But she didn't. As she passed, the faint scent of oil and metal lingered. She disappeared into the dark outside the hangar, her steps soundless, her presence fading like a ghost dissolving into the night. Thorne stood there long after she was gone, the echo of her words looping in his head. Travel light. He turned, eyes falling on a pile of sandbags stacked haphazardly near the wall, left behind by some careless crew. And suddenly, he understood what he needed to do. No speech, no apology. Action. So he started moving them. Each one weighed nearly 100 pounds. He lifted the first, shoulders screaming, and carried it across the hangar, stacking it neatly against the far wall. Then another, and another. Hours passed, sweat soaked through his fatigues, his arms trembled, his back ached, but he didn't stop. Each bag became something more than sand. Each one was a weight he'd been carrying: arrogance, pride, fear, entitlement. And with every lift, he was setting them down. When he finished, the sun was just beginning to bleed through the high windows. He stood in silence, chest heaving, staring at the neat wall he'd built. He didn't know if she'd ever know what he'd done. It didn't matter. Some lessons don't need an audience. He came to attention, perfectly straight before the wall. Not as a cadet captain, not as a leader. Just as a man who had finally learned to stand still. Later that day, the sandbag wall was gone. Moved to the proper storage yard by maintenance crews who never knew who had built it. But someone, maybe one of them, maybe not, left a small note on the workbench where she'd sat. It said in careful block letters, "Travel light." No one ever claimed to have written it. That week the base resumed its schedule, but nothing was the same. Thorne no longer demanded attention, he earned it. He listened when others spoke, he corrected without humiliation. He volunteered for the hardest drills. And though the instructors never mentioned Spectre again, her presence hung in the air like a quiet law. Every cadet knew the story. Every one of them carried a fragment of it inside. But for Thorne, it wasn't just a legend, it was personal. He had seen her stillness up close. He had felt the weight of his own arrogance collapse beneath her silence. He didn't know where she'd gone, but sometimes during dawn training, when the fog hung low over the field, he'd catch himself glancing toward that same mess hall corner, half expecting to see her there. Always alone. Always calm. And though she never returned, her lesson did. Every day, in every decision, every hesitation he resisted. He didn't need her to speak again. Because she already had. Not with words, but with silence. And silence, he finally understood, was the loudest sound in the world. 5 years later, the desert wind still sounded like the siren from that day. Different pitch, same reminder, nothing stays still forever. Captain Marcus Thorne stood in the dust of a New Mexico training range, eyes narrowed against the heat. The sun turned everything white. The air smelled of metal and salt and scorched earth. He was harder now, his once smooth face carved by wind and sleep deprivation, his posture quieter, heavier. The loud confidence was gone. What remained was something leaner, competence born of failure. The cadet who had once pointed a toy gun at a legend was dead. What stood in his place was a soldier who finally understood the cost of silence. Around him, a platoon of brand-new lieutenants fidgeted under the weight of the sun, fresh out of West Point, boots too clean, voices too loud. He watched them with an expression that might have been pride or pity. It was hard to tell. The exercise was simple, communications set up under simulated fire. But the young officers were already arguing. Voices clashed in the dry air, orders barked, questions snapped, egos bumping into each other like loaded rifles. Thorne said nothing, he just listened. A few yards away, a lieutenant named Hayes, tall, sharp-jawed, the kind of man who mistook command for dominance, was berating a private for setting an antenna 5 degrees off alignment. "You think this is a joke?" Hayes barked, his tone dripping with the same sarcasm Thorne once wore like armor. "You can't even read a compass. Maybe I'll draw you a picture next time." The private mumbled an apology, cheeks burning. Thorne didn't move, didn't interrupt. He just watched. When the shouting died down, he walked over, slow and deliberate. The platoon straightened instinctively. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said, voice even. "Sir?" Hayes snapped to attention, still flushed with self-righteous adrenaline. "Walk with me." They moved away from the others, boots crunching on gravel. Inside Thorne's tent, the air was cooler, shaded. A lantern flickered on the small table beside a folded map. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just deliberate. "Sir, I was correcting a mistake," Hayes said finally, defensive. "We can't afford sloppiness." Thorne raised a hand. "You're right." Hayes blinked, thrown off. "Sir." "You're right," Thorne repeated. "We can't afford sloppiness, but there's a difference between correction and humiliation." Hayes frowned, unsure where this was going. Thorne sat down, motioned to the empty chair across from him. "Sit." The younger man obeyed stiffly. Thorne poured 2 cups of bitter field coffee. Neither drank. Then Thorne said quietly, "I'm going to tell you a story. It's not in any manual, but it might save you and the people who follow you more than once." Hayes nodded, cautious now. Thorne stared at the lantern flame, voice soft, measured. "It happened when I was where you are, a company commander at West Point Field. I thought I understood leadership. I thought command meant volume, presence, fear." He smiled faintly, not fondly, but with the ache of someone remembering a scar. "One day I saw someone sitting alone in the mess tent. Gray hair, plain clothes, civilian, eating in silence, and I decided she was beneath me." Hayes didn't speak. "So I told her to move," Thorne continued. "Told her she was in my spot. When she didn't, I drew my weapon, a training pistol." Hayes' eyes widened. Thorne nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's stupid." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The flame danced between them. "Before I could finish my little performance, the alarm sounded. Chaos hit, and in that chaos I saw something I've never forgotten." He paused, eyes distant, seeing it again. She stood up, and in less than 2 seconds she neutralized 2 elite ranger instructors who had stormed the tent. Didn't yell, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe wrong, just moved, like the world had slowed down to let her finish what she'd started. Hayes stared. Thorne's voice softened, and then the general, a 2-star, walked in. He saluted her. He let that sink in. The woman I just threatened with a blue barrel pistol was one of the most decorated special operators in U.S. history. They called her Spectre. The tent was quiet except for the low hum of the lantern. "She taught me the single most important lesson of my life," Thorne said, "that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest, it's the quietest." Hayes shifted uneasily. Thorne continued, voice steady. "Leadership isn't about being heard, it's about being trusted. Respect isn't owed to rank, it's earned by competence. And silence," he smiled faintly, "silence is what power sounds like when it's confident." He sat back. "I embarrassed myself that day because I was trying to prove I mattered. I thought shouting made me strong. All it did was show how weak I was." Hayes' shoulders lowered. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by thought. "Sir," he said quietly, "what happened to her?" Thorne looked at the flame again. It flickered, stretched, and then steadied. "No one knows," he said. "She disappeared the next morning, but she left something behind." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small, smooth stone, gray, ordinary, unremarkable. "She left this on the table where she ate," he said. "I keep it to remind myself to travel light." Hayes frowned slightly. Travel light. Thorne nodded. It was the only thing she ever said to me. Assumptions are heavy, cadet. They weigh you down. Travel light. Took me years to understand what she meant. She wasn't talking about gear. He closed his hand around the stone. She was talking about ego. The two men sat in silence. Outside, the wind rattled the tent flaps like distant gunfire. Finally, Hayes spoke, voice low. I was wrong today. Thorne didn't answer. He didn't need to. The admission hung in the air, quiet, honest, unforced. When Hayes finally stood to leave, he paused at the tent flap. Sir, what do I do now? Thorne looked up, eyes calm. Listen, he said. Observe, lead softly, and remember you never know who you're sitting across from. Hayes nodded and stepped out into the sun. Thorne remained seated for a long time, the stone warm in his hand. He could almost hear her voice again, low, measured, steady. Travel light. He smiled. That night, as the platoon slept, Thorne walked alone to the perimeter ridge. The desert stretched endless under a vault of stars. He thought about the woman with the silver hair, the one who had humiliated him into humility. He wondered where she was, if she was still alive, still out there in the gray places where wars never make the news. But he didn't need to know. Because in a way, she was still everywhere. In the steady hands of a medic calming a panicked recruit. In the quiet discipline of an engineer repairing a radio under fire. In the silence between orders, when real soldiers measured twice before they spoke once. She had become a principle. Not a name, not a legend. A truth. The Spectre's principle. He whispered it to himself, letting the words settle like dust. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest. They're the quietest. And in that quiet, Thorne found peace. He turned back toward the camp. In the distance, he saw Hayes standing watch, posture steady, eyes scanning the horizon, calm, silent, focused. Thorne smiled. The lesson had already begun to move on, like a torch passed hand to hand without ceremony. He took one last look at the night sky. Thank you, he murmured. The wind caught the words and carried them off across the dunes, a message to a ghost who would never need to hear it to know. In the months that followed, Thorne's reputation spread, not for heroics, not for medals, but for something rarer. He built teams that functioned like clockwork. Units where no one raised their voice, yet every task was done to perfection. Men and women who moved like parts of a single will, quiet, efficient, dangerous. They called them the Silent Platoon. He didn't mind the nickname, because in their silence he heard her echo. Every operation, every mission, every calm order issued under fire, it all came from the day he'd tried to take a stranger's lunch. He never told the story for glory. He told it so others wouldn't repeat his mistake. And every time he ended it the same way, softly, the way she might have. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. He'd pause, look around the room, and add one last truth, the quietest of all. And when it does, the world listens. They called it a story. But stories fade. This one didn't. The Spectre's principle, what began as a whisper inside one tent at West Point, began to travel, slowly, silently, like the woman herself. It moved through conversations in barracks and command centers. It appeared in quiet debriefs after missions that went right for reasons no one could quite explain. It showed up in leadership evaluations and unspoken expectations. No one ever mentioned her name, because no one really knew it. But everyone knew her kind. Quiet, controlled, deadly precise. The kind of person who didn't need to shout to be obeyed. The military had always trained for strength, for dominance, for visible command. But Spectre had taught something older, something deeper. That power, when it's real, doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. Captain Thorne never sought to preach her lesson. He didn't hold seminars or write doctrine. He didn't need to. His soldiers learned by example. He led softly. He corrected in private. He listened more than he spoke. In every briefing, his calm steadiness drew others toward silence, and in that silence, his teams found focus. They noticed things others missed. Small shifts in enemy patterns, a flicker of light before an ambush, the weight of a decision before it fell. It wasn't magic, it was mindfulness weaponized. The kind of awareness Evelyn Reed had lived and breathed. And though Thorne never mentioned her directly, he carried her in every decision. When new officers came in too loud, too sure of themselves, he didn't shout them down. He'd simply say, "Look for the quietest person in the room, then ask yourself why they don't need to talk." He'd leave it there like a stone dropped into still water and let the ripples do the rest. The story grew. From Thorne's platoon to neighboring battalions. From training camps to special operations circles. And with every retelling, the legend evolved. Some said she'd been Delta Force. Others whispered CIA, maybe even Joint Task Force Omega, the unit so secret it officially didn't exist. A few swore she wasn't real at all, a parable built from fragments of 100 soldiers who'd learned humility the hard way. But those who'd been there, the ones who'd seen the footage before it was locked behind security firewalls, knew. They'd seen the way she moved. The economy of motion, the perfect balance of violence and restraint. They called it the Spectre correction. Not a fight. Not dominance. Just inevitability. Like gravity reminding you which way the world really turns. Years later, at a special operations base overseas, 2 NCOs sat under a canvas awning, cleaning their weapons. The younger one, a new arrival, was complaining about a captain who barked orders for show. The older one, a master sergeant with scars on both arms and eyes like worn steel, smirked. "Let me tell you a story," he said. And he did. He told it in a low, steady voice, pausing only to load another magazine. About the cadet who pointed a gun at a civilian woman for her lunch. About how the woman dismantled 2 instructors in under 3 seconds. About how a general had saluted her. When he finished, the younger soldier sat in silence. "Was it true?" he finally asked. The older man smiled faintly. "Does it matter?" He slid the bolt forward with a metallic click. "Truth or myth," he said, "every time I start to open my mouth to show off, I remember her. Whoever she was keeps me alive." That was how her legacy spread, not through lectures or citations, but through firelight, field tents, and late-night confessions. Each time someone told the story, it changed slightly. But the lesson stayed the same. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest. It became a proverb, passed from squad to squad, from instructors to recruits. At first it was spoken with awe. Then with understanding. Eventually with respect. The name Spectre turned from rumor to reverence. A code. A principle. A quiet North Star. And yet, through all the years that followed, Marcus Thorne never stopped wondering what had happened to her. He'd risen through the ranks, captain to major, later lieutenant colonel, each promotion carrying less pride and more weight. He led missions others turned down. He lost friends. He carried their names on slips of paper in his chest pocket. He found himself speaking less, thinking more. The silence that used to haunt him had become his anchor. But on certain nights, usually after the worst missions, the bloodiest, the ones that demanded decisions no man should have to make, he'd find a quiet corner, take out the smooth stone she'd left behind, and rub it between his fingers. Not for luck. For grounding. He never prayed. But in those moments, it felt close enough. One winter, while stationed in Eastern Europe, Thorne attended a classified briefing in a bunker near Ramstein. The topic, Emergent Threat Doctrine, Non-Traditional Warfare Assets. It was dry, bureaucratic, and as forgettable as every other meeting, until the final slide. A still image appeared on the projector. Grainy monochrome. A figure in a gray field jacket and headscarf, walking alone across a ruined compound. The presenter, a colonel from intelligence, said, "This footage was recovered from a black site operation 3 years ago. The subject remains unidentified. Call sign unknown. Facial recognition yields 0 results." Thorne leaned forward. The footage advanced 1 frame, then another. And there it was, the gait, the posture, the stillness in motion. He felt his throat tighten. It was her. He didn't say anything. Didn't ask. Didn't need to. Because some ghosts aren't meant to be chased. They appear when they want to remind you they're still watching. The next morning, he deleted the frame he'd quietly copied onto his datapad. Some truths, he thought, were lighter when carried alone. Travel light. He smiled. The Spectre's principle eventually entered unofficial doctrine. Not written. Whispered. It was taught to new recruits under different names: quiet command, discipline of stillness, command presence. But those who knew the origin always called it what it was. Spectre's way. And every time an officer paused before shouting. Every time a sergeant corrected with calm instead of rage. Every time a soldier took the time to see instead of assume. Her legacy lived again. She had changed the military without ever giving an order, without writing a report, without seeking a title. She had become a standard no one could measure, but everyone could feel. Years later, when Major Thorne retired, he was invited to speak at the academy. He stood in the same hall where cadets once laughed at his arrogance. Now they listened in silence. He didn't talk about tactics. He didn't talk about medals. He told them a story. About a woman in gray who ate alone. About a young fool with too much pride and too little sense. About how, in one moment of humiliation, he found his humanity. And when he finished, he didn't give them advice. He gave them a question. When the time comes and you face silence, will you recognize it for what it is, or mistake it for weakness? He let the question hang there. No slides. No applause. Just silence. And in that silence, some of them understood. The rest would, one day. Afterward, as the cadets filed out, one young woman approached him, small, quiet, eyes sharp with curiosity. "Sir," she said, "the woman in your story, do you think she's still out there?" Thorne smiled faintly. "She was never gone," he said. "Some people don't need to be seen to lead." He paused, then added softly, "They just teach us how." The cadet nodded slowly. "Travel light, sir." Thorne chuckled, the sound dry, warm, and proud. "Yeah," he said, "travel light." That night he walked to the mess hall, older now, slower, and found himself standing in the corner where it had all begun. The table was new. The walls had been repainted. But the air still carried the echo. He reached into his pocket, felt the smooth stone. And for the first time in years, he placed it down. Not because he was done learning, but because the lesson had already traveled farther than he ever could. He whispered into the empty air, "Mission complete, ma'am." Then turned and walked away, leaving the stone behind for whoever would find it next. Stories die when they stop teaching. But hers never stopped. Years passed, generations shifted, wars began, ended, and began again under new names. And through all of it, the Spectre's principle endured, unrecorded, uncredited, unbreakable. It lived in the pause before decisions, in the silence between orders, in the eyes of soldiers who had learned the difference between fear and focus. It became a culture, not one of noise and medals, but of presence and patience. Somewhere in the forests of Eastern Europe, a reconnaissance unit crouched in a freezing tree line, waiting for extraction. The enemy was close, too close. Radios hissed static, the wind carried whispers of movement. Sergeant Ramirez, 32, crouched behind his scope. His men were tense, jittery from exhaustion and adrenaline. He whispered, "Hold fire." Private Lee, the youngest, hissed back, "They're right there, Sarge. Let's take the shot." Ramirez shook his head. "No, look again." Lee exhaled, peered through his optics. What he'd thought were enemy rifles were actually antenna masts glinting in the moonlight. He froze, his breath hitched. Ramirez smiled faintly. "Assumptions are heavy, kid," he murmured. "Travel light." The words didn't come from training manuals. They came from a story. A legend told one night years ago in a different tent, by a commander who had once been humbled into wisdom. Spectre had never met these men. Yet she just saved their lives. At Fort Benning, an instructor watched a class of recruits crawl through the mud, screaming at each other to hurry. He didn't shout. He didn't bark corrections. He just waited. When the last exhausted recruit collapsed at the finish line, he said quietly, "You're loud when you're unsure. Be silent when you know." The words weren't in any training guide. They were echoes, passed down from men and women who'd carried them across decades. And in that moment, the instructor could almost see her, gray hair pulled back, calm eyes cutting through the noise of the world. He never met her, but he'd been trained by someone who had. That was enough. Across oceans, in places where soldiers had no names and missions had no paperwork, the principle kept surfacing. In a forward base carved into a mountain in Afghanistan, a medic knelt beside a wounded corporal. Mortars thudded somewhere in the distance. The corporal's voice trembled, "Are we gonna make it?" The medic's hands never stopped working. He looked the man in the eyes. "Stay quiet," he said softly. "Focus on breathing. Noise wastes energy." The corporal managed a weak laugh. "You sound like my old co." The medic smiled. "Good, then you'll live." He didn't realize he was quoting a ghost. Meanwhile, back home, academies began teaching the Spectre case study. A sanitized version, stripped of names and emotion, filed under behavioral leadership dynamics. But outside the classroom, the instructors told the real story, the one that mattered. How cadets' arrogance met a woman's silence. How power bowed before discipline. How a single act of calm redefined leadership more effectively than 1,000 speeches. Students leaned forward when they told that part, the part the official files never mentioned. "And she didn't say a word," they'd whisper. "Not one." For young officers bred in a world obsessed with noise, social media, self-promotion, performative leadership, the idea was radical. That maybe the loudest voice in the room wasn't the strongest. That maybe the real leaders didn't boast, they simply were. And for a few of them, that idea stuck. Thorne lived to see it happen. Decades had carved his face into something weathered but kind. His hair was white now, his stride slower, but his presence still commanded attention, not because he demanded it, but because silence followed him like an aura. He spent his retirement consulting for officer programs, lecturing quietly, never taking credit for the legend that had shaped him. He never once said her name. Because some names aren't meant to be said, they're meant to be remembered through action. Sometimes he wondered if she was still alive. Other times he hoped she wasn't, because he wanted to believe she'd earned her peace. But when he looked into the eyes of new leaders who carried her principle forward, he saw her living still. One evening, Thorne sat on his porch overlooking the desert. The horizon was painted in dying gold. Wind brushed through the dry grass, soft and steady. He reached into his pocket, not for the stone he'd once carried. That was gone now, left behind for someone else. Instead, he held a folded piece of paper. A letter. It had arrived years after he'd left service. No return address, just a wax seal pressed with a trident and a sword. Inside, the handwriting was neat, almost clinical. Captain Thorne, I heard you're still teaching. That's good. Keep doing it. The quiet kind are still needed. And remember, travel light. He never told anyone he'd received it. He didn't need to. He burned it gently that night, watching the flame rise against the twilight. But the words remained, etched somewhere deeper than paper. Years later, when Thorne passed, his military effects were catalogued by a young archivist at the academy. Among them was a small notebook filled with quotes, notes and stories written in his careful, block-letter hand. At the bottom of the final page, in faded ink, were 2 lines. The world doesn't need louder soldiers. It needs steadier ones. The archivist underlined the phrase before closing the book. She didn't know why, but it felt like something sacred. Over time, the legend outgrew its origin. In one part of the world, Spectre became a myth, the nameless guardian who appeared when arrogance needed correction. In another, she was spoken of like a code of conduct, a model of poise under fire. But wherever the story went, its heart stayed the same. True power doesn't shout. It doesn't seek attention. It simply performs flawlessly, humbly, quietly. And somewhere, maybe in the silence between wars, she smiled. Years later, a young lieutenant named Elena Ward, one of Thorne's last students, stood on a rain-soaked airfield preparing for her first deployment. The engines roared. Her squad waited for her command. She looked around at their faces, scared, eager, trusting. For a moment, she felt the same uncertainty that had once lived inside Marcus Thorne. That fear of not being enough. Then she remembered his voice. When in doubt, lead softly. She took a deep breath, stepped onto the ramp, and said only 3 words. Eyes up, move. No shouting, no posturing. Just calm. The soldiers followed, steady, focused, silent. Halfway across the world, under a different sky, the Spectre's principle lived again. In the decades that followed, military historians debated whether she had ever truly existed. Some called her myth. Others called her metaphor. But to those who felt her presence through the chain of stories, through the quiet guidance of mentors who had inherited her lesson, she was something more. She was the invisible line between confidence and arrogance, between noise and purpose, between authority and respect. The older soldiers didn't argue. They just smiled when her name came up. Because they knew the truth. She was real whether she still breathed or not. And she had changed them all. One final memory, one that never left Thorne, surfaced in the collective retelling of her story. The way she had looked at him that day in the mess tent, not with anger, not with pity, but with recognition. As if she had seen something inside him worth saving. And maybe that was her greatest gift. Not the precision, not the strength, not even the silence. But the mercy. The quiet belief that even arrogance could be remade into humility if given the right kind of mirror. Now, when recruits at West Point pass by the corner of the mess hall, they see a small plaque on the wall. No official insignia. No rank. No name. Just an engraving. The Spectre's table, respect is earned in silence. Cadets stop there sometimes, not for ceremony but for reflection. And if you listen closely in that hall, between the clatter of trays and the hum of voices, you can almost hear it. A faint echo. A spoon clicking against a tray. A heartbeat of stillness. A reminder that one quiet moment can ripple across generations. That sometimes the most profound sound in the world is the absence of it. Legends rarely stay where they're born. They travel quietly, like the wind carrying sand across continents, leaving patterns that no one can trace, only recognize. And so, the specter's principle moved beyond the base, beyond the ranks, beyond the boundaries of uniform and protocol. At first it was small, a quote remembered, a phrase repeated. Then it became something else, a compass, a way of living. In a glass-walled office overlooking a sleepless city, a CEO sat in silence while his board argued. Voices overlapped, sharp and competitive, each executive fighting to sound certain. Numbers clashed, opinions collided. The air was thick with noise. But the CEO, a former captain, once trained under a man named Thorne, said nothing. He watched, listened, waited, and when the arguing reached its peak, he simply asked, "Who here actually listened to what was said, not what they wanted to hear?" The room fell still. Silence. And in that silence, truth surfaced. The decision they made that night saved the company from collapse. When asked later about his leadership style, he smiled faintly. "I learned it from a soldier," he said. "The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest." In a classroom thousands of miles away, a teacher stood before a restless group of teenagers. They were loud, distracted, tired. No amount of shouting worked. So one morning she stopped. When the class grew noisy, she simply sat down, folded her hands, and waited. The silence was uncomfortable at first, then confusing, then contagious. Within a minute, the chatter died. The students looked at her. She said softly, "Respect isn't commanded, it's earned." They listened. Years later, one of those students became a Marine, another became a journalist, a third became a doctor. Each of them would remember her calm, her silence, her steadiness, and later learn that she'd once been a cadet at West Point, long after the Spectre's table had become part of its quiet lore. Across the world, leadership courses began referencing a case study about an unnamed operative who embodied the essence of calm authority. No one used her call sign anymore. The word Spectre had faded from official files. But her lesson remained. Competence is quiet. Arrogance is loud. Choose which one you serve. Years later, a journalist researching leadership in the military stumbled across a classified memo from 2009, marked only with an insignia, a trident and a sword. The document contained one sentence: "Strength is measured not in decibels, but in discipline." He didn't know it yet, but those words had been written by General Ivan Wallace, the same man who'd once saluted her in a mess tent. That one line became the opening quote of his book, The Quiet Commander, which would become a global bestseller, inspiring leaders, athletes, and parents alike. The Spectre's principle had crossed over into civilian life, disguised as wisdom. In a small diner in Kansas, an elderly woman with silver streaks in her hair stirred her coffee quietly as a young waitress vented about her boss. "He just yells all day," the waitress said, exhausted. "Thinks that makes him important." The woman smiled faintly, eyes kind but sharp. "Loud isn't strong," she said softly. "It's just loud." The waitress laughed. "You sound like you've seen that kind before." The woman looked out the window, where sunlight poured across the asphalt like memory. "Once or twice," she said. She left a generous tip. And when the waitress came back to clear the table, she found a small, smooth gray stone sitting beside the empty coffee cup. No note, no name. Just a stone, clean, ordinary, and heavier than it looked. It said that history forgets people, but remembers principles. And hers had become one of them. In leadership conferences, her story was told without attribution. In universities, it was analyzed as the silent response model. In ethics programs, it was called the Reed equation, an unofficial name, whispered by those who'd pieced together fragments from redacted reports. But no one ever truly found her. Because you don't find ghosts. You follow them. Somewhere in a quiet mountain cabin far from anything resembling civilization, a woman lived alone. Her hair was completely white now, her movements slower but deliberate, her presence still unshakable. Every morning she brewed tea, cleaned her rifle, and watched the world through a fogged window. No medals hung on her walls, no photographs. Just silence vast, unbroken, and earned. Once a week, she hiked down the path into the small town below to buy supplies. The locals didn't know her past, they just called her Ms. Eve. Kind eyes, polite, keeps to herself. But the sheriff, a veteran who'd served 20 years, noticed the way she scanned the horizon whenever she entered a room. The way her hands never trembled. The way her gaze never stayed still. He never asked. Some questions deserve to stay unanswered. That spring, a local high school invited her to speak on resilience and service. She almost declined. But something, curiosity perhaps, made her say yes. On the day of the talk, she stood in front of a gym full of teenagers, holding nothing but a small stone in her palm. No notes, no slides. When the principal introduced her as a retired consultant, a few students whispered, unimpressed. She smiled faintly. Then she said, "You want to know what strength looks like?" They fell quiet. "It's not about how loud you speak," she continued. "It's about how still you stay when the world starts shouting." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried. People mistake silence for weakness. It's not, it's preparation. She paused, eyes sweeping the room. Respect is earned quietly. Discipline is built privately. Dignity doesn't speak. She looked down at the stone in her hand, turning it once between her fingers. It simply acts. The words hung there, weightless and eternal. The students didn't applaud right away. They just absorbed it. And in that moment, the story came full circle. Months later, when she passed away peacefully in her sleep, the sheriff was the one who packed up her things. In a drawer, he found a small stack of notebooks. Most were blank. One contained a single sentence written in neat block letters. "If they remember the principal, they don't need the name." The sheriff closed the notebook, set it back, and saluted, though he didn't know why. Maybe instinct. Maybe respect. When he stepped outside, the wind caught the edge of the curtain, letting sunlight spill into the empty cabin. It landed on the stone sitting by the window, gray, smooth, familiar. In the years that followed, a scholarship was created at West Point for cadets who demonstrated quiet excellence. It didn't reward grades. It didn't reward loud leadership. It honored those who led by example, who commanded by calm. The plaque beside it bore no signature. Just a phrase. The Spectre's principle, true strength doesn't speak. Every year, a single cadet received it. And every year, as they stood on stage under the echo of applause, the room grew quieter, because even now, decades later, her silence still demanded it. In time, the story blurred into legend, and the legend into myth. But even myths, when they carry truth, become part of the human code, invisible, eternal. And somewhere in the spaces between noise, her voice, or maybe the absence of it, lingered. A reminder that greatness isn't in volume, or fame, or command. It's in stillness, in composure, in the calm that turns fear into precision. The Spectre's principle had escaped the uniform. It had entered the bloodstream of humanity. And it would stay there, as long as there were people willing to pause before speaking, to think before acting, to lead without shouting. Because dignity doesn't need to speak. It doesn't need medals, or acknowledgement, or applause. It just is. Time has a strange way of remembering. It forgets faces. It erases names, but it never forgets the feeling a person leaves behind. And she, Spectre, had left behind a silence that outlasted sound. Years after her passing, a young cadet walked alone through the old mess hall at West Point. The night was quiet, the air thick with history. He paused before the small brass plaque by the corner table. The Spectre's table, respect is earned in silence. He'd passed it 100 times before, but that night it felt different. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because he'd just come from a disciplinary hearing, accused of disobeying an order. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't defended himself. He'd simply chosen to protect his team instead of his reputation. And though he'd been reprimanded, something inside him whispered that he'd done the right thing. Now standing there, he stared at the plaque and whispered softly, "I hope you'd understand." He didn't know who she was, or if she was even real. But the silence that filled that corner seemed to answer him. Not with words, but with peace. Outside, the rain began to fall, gentle, rhythmic, cleansing. The cadet walked out into it without an umbrella, letting it wash over his uniform, his doubts, his pride. He didn't notice the faint engraving someone had carved into the wood beneath the plaque years ago. Travel light. The Spectre's story had reached its final form, no longer history, not quite myth. It had become a moral frequency, resonating in people who had never met her, never heard her name, but carried her voice anyway. Like an echo that no one remembers starting. In the decades that followed, her name was never printed in textbooks. There were no statues, no medals, no documentaries. But her presence could still be felt, in every act of quiet strength, every moment of calm before chaos. In boardrooms where leaders chose patience over ego. In classrooms where teachers led without shouting. In homes where parents taught by example instead of punishment. Even in battlefields, where young soldiers steadied their breathing and remembered that noise never wins wars, awareness does. She had become a part of the human rhythm. One evening, at a global leadership symposium, a gray-haired general took the stage. He wasn't famous. He wasn't charismatic. But when he spoke, the room fell silent. "I want to tell you a story," he began, "about someone whose name I don't know. Someone who changed everything I believed about command." And he told it, the story of the cadet, the mess hall, the silence, the gun. The legend of the woman who didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't need to prove herself. When he finished, no one applauded. They just sat there still, thoughtful. And that silence, once again, became her signature. In the back row, a young woman sat listening, a journalist covering the event. She couldn't explain it, but the story stirred something deep inside her. That night, she began writing an article titled, "The Quietest Warrior." It wasn't meant to go viral, but it did. Within weeks, millions of people around the world were reading about a nameless soldier who had taught humility without saying a word. There were debates, some claimed it was fiction, others swore it was truth. But none of that mattered. Because somewhere in that collective silence after reading, something shifted. The world for a moment paused. People began reflecting differently, not on what they could say, but what they shouldn't. Parents spoke softer. Teachers listened longer. Leaders thought before reacting. The noise of the world, for a heartbeat, bent around the principle of stillness. It didn't last forever. Nothing pure ever does. But it lasted long enough. Long enough to prove that silence, when rooted in purpose, can move entire generations. Years later, a historian compiling stories of unsung heroes visited a small town nestled between mountains and mist. He'd heard rumors that a woman had once lived there quietly, buying supplies, rarely speaking. He found her cabin. Dusty, empty. Inside, only one thing remained on the windowsill, a smooth gray stone. He picked it up, turned it over in his palm, and felt a strange calm wash over him. It was ordinary, and yet it felt deliberate. He placed it back where he'd found it and left without taking a photograph. Some things, he thought, aren't meant to be documented. They're meant to be respected. In the final years of the century, her name surfaced again, briefly, quietly, in a military journal titled Principles of Ethical Command. In an appendix, under the heading Unknown Contributor, was a line believed to be from her notes. True command is the ability to remain human when the world demands that you are. It was unsigned, but everyone who read it knew who it belonged to. Sometimes on anniversaries of lost soldiers, veterans still gather. Old men and women, their uniforms replaced by worn jackets and soft laughter. And when the conversation drifts to lessons that never left them, one of them inevitably mentions her. They don't say her name. They don't have to. They just fall quiet for a few seconds. And in that stillness, that shared silence, she's there again. Not as a ghost, not as a hero, as a reminder that strength isn't about how loud you can stand. It's about how deeply you can stay. Years fade. Wars chain. Uniforms evolve. But the rhythm of her story remains, a soft heartbeat beneath the machinery of modern life. Every generation rediscovers it in its own way. And every time it does, it feels new, though it's as old as discipline itself. Somewhere in a future none of us will see, a young cadet not yet born will face their own test. They'll stand before someone older, quieter, stronger. And they'll make the same mistake every generation makes, mistaking calm for weakness. And maybe, just maybe, that person will remind them, gently, silently, without anger, what real strength looks like. And the story will begin again. Because legends never die. They just change form. They live in behavior, in principle, in choice. She had never wanted to be remembered. She only wanted to make others remember themselves. To remind them that decency and discipline can coexist with fire. That silence can be as loud as courage. That calm can command more power than rage. And that sometimes the most extraordinary thing you can do is stay still. When the world speaks too loudly, remember her. The woman who ate in silence. The cadet who learned humility. The base that never forgot. A story that outgrew its soldiers and became a human truth. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.